While Modi, I think, was far more freer, though the BJP too, RSS, were far more conservative when it came to Pakistan. But Modi, I think, had the freedom to experiment with diplomacy. For example, on the Hurriyat thing, from the beginning, they said, look, if you come here, we're not going to let you meet the Hurriyat guys, which was the custom for the previous 20 years. So they were determined to stop it, they did. But at the same time, he was willing to, go out of the way to reach out to the Pakistani leaders, like landing up on a few hours' notice in Rawalpindi, Nawaz Sharif's home.
This week in your column, Raja Mandala, for the Indian Express opinion section, which is a weekly, everyone should check it out. The link will be in the description and on the Indian Express website, of course. So you take off from Kashmir and the sort of Gupkar alliance and the PM's impending meeting, the new moves, and what that means vis-a-vis India and Pakistan. Because and you outline quite well, over the last couple of years, there's been a series of, I think post-August 2019 and in the last year or so, first the ceasefire, then a whole bunch of other signals from here and there. And from Pakistan's, you look quite extensively at the debate in Pakistan and the kind of internal decisions. But first I wanted to ask, there's something you mentioned about this altered script since 2019. That for better or worse, what Mr. Modi has done is that he's managed to sort of inject a level of uncertainty into what India's reactions will be, whether in terms of Kashmir, whether in terms of responding to terrorist attacks. The one thing is this, how do you see this? Is this a planned uncertainty? Or is it a sort of, the critics of the government have often argued that it's not a plan. It's not as though this was the strategic response, of course, you can argue was an escalation in a certain way, but say meeting Nawaz Sharif twice and then the attack happened, and you invite Pakistan to investigate Pakistan military for the Pathankot attack, and then it doesn't work out. Then so there's sort of oscillation between in those initial years, it seemed that in fact the plan was to do an outreach and it failed, and then this sort of hardline stance and as much for domestic policy. How do you see that? How much is this is a planned out strategy for?
Look, when governments do things, I think not everything is planned, and even when they have a plan, the moment it meets reality, it goes, melts down into something else. But I think we got to give credit where it is due. For example, Ajit Doval, who is the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, from day one, and even before he became the National Security Advisor, because he's Director of Intelligence Bureau, he served in Pakistan. So one of his consistent arguments has been that, look, India needs deterrence. That is, it can't just simply, just say hoping that talks will solve problems with Pakistan. It should be able to prevent Pakistan or raise the costs for Pakistan in conducting cross-border terrorism. But that was the principal dilemma for India, from the time Pakistan got nuclear weapons in the late 80s till recently, that Pakistan seemed to have nuclear impunity, that it could do anything and India would not retaliate. So I think the idea that they were struggling with this idea, that how do you change this calculus? And I think this government had come into power with a clear need to change that game. And that's why the surgical strikes or using their power, and then having the confidence that you can fend off or you can deal with American intervention, which is what Pakistan calculation was. Raise the crisis. If India raises the crisis, we'll get Americans to talk about Kashmir. Indians figured it out that, look, you can raise the temperature and compel the Americans to put pressure on Pakistan to stop terrorism. So I think it's been a far more self-confident, assured strategy in terms of deterrence. Second, I think on the diplomatic side, that unlike the UPA government, and Vajpayee government, I think they're small minorities. They were hesitant to do big things. For example, Vajpayee certainly did. He traveled to Pakistan twice, opened up conversation. Manmohan Singh also, I think, built on that. But for example, he wouldn't travel to Pakistan. At one point, the Pakistanis and Musharraf were very eager to host him. But I think within the Congress party, there was a reluctance to do something new, something creative, because after all, Manmohan Singh had negotiated a secret solution on Kashmir, but he couldn't carry that forward because of the political reluctance in the Congress party to let him push with new ideas. While Modi, I think, was far more freer, though the BJP too, RSS were far more conservative when it came to Pakistan. But Modi, I think, had the freedom to experiment with diplomacy. For example, on the Hurriyat thing, I mean, from the beginning, they said, look, if you come here, we're not going to let you meet the Hurriyat guys. I mean, which was the custom for the previous 20 years. So they were determined to stop it, they did. But at the same time, he was willing to, go out of the way to reach out to the Pakistani leaders, like landing up on a few hours' notice in Rawalpindi, Nawaz Sharif's home. So I think they had the strength politically, they had the boldness and the strategy to produce deterrence. I think that worked in producing uncertainty. Now you can say still at the end of it, all this is not good enough to force Pakistan to behave differently. But I think there is today equations have changed a little bit since the UPA time.
So one of the interesting things in the piece I found was that, I mean, going back to Mr. Doval, going back to the NSA, one of those age-old things that, at least for the last few years, every time we talk about how the big thing is who to talk to in Pakistan. The civilian government is not quite there. But do you think that has sort of been cracked, at least for now, with, say, Mr. Doval being the prime diplomatic lead for India? It seems like that. He's the one who was conducting back-channel talks. He's very much involved. He knows Pakistan well as an intelligence officer. And with Mr. Bajwa, with his geoeconomics, which you've written about earlier, as well as in this piece, or moving from geopolitics to geoeconomics, do you think that conundrum is solved? Or are those internal things? Because there will be political pressure, just like in India. I mean, peace with India, peace with Pakistan, and both countries is one of those things that can be used for political capital.
A lot of ironies here. I mean, I think you asked a good question. I mean, for example, I don't think the problem of who to talk has been solved fully. When army is in the front office, that is, they're running everything, it's easier to negotiate. I mean, example, you had General Musharraf, who was everything. He was CEO, army chief, he was president, he was unquestioned boss of Pakistan. So then you could negotiate a Kashmir agreement with him, with Manmohan Singh. In fact, that time the problem was with India, less with Pakistan. So I think you did negotiate when there was a clear central authority. But when we tried to negotiate with Nawaz Sharif, for example, now by then you had a hybrid regime, a civilian prime minister who was on his own, and then an army at the back. So when India negotiated with Nawaz Sharif under the Modi government, the impact Nawaz Sharif got in trouble because of his positive attitude to India. In fact, you remember the so-called Dawn League story a few years ago. That in fact, Nawaz Sharif said, look, we must stop terror, reach out to our neighbors and which is exactly what Bajwa is saying today. But I was punished for saying that and ousted for being too traitorous, to, crossing the line when it came to India, terror and that kind of thing. Today, the paradox is, it is Bajwa who's saying, we need to change. We need to engage India. We need to have peace in the region. Let's bury the past and move forward. But it's Imran Khan, the civilian leader, who's actually raising maximalist positions, saying, look, this can't be done. We can't trade with India. Even just importing 2 items, it was no big deal. There is shortage in Pakistan. India is cheap resource available. But then after agreeing, Imran Khan pulled back. So I think it raises questions that is there a tension between General Bajwa and Prime Minister Imran Khan? Are they on the same page when it comes to India or the US? There are those questions. And I think the problem will be with us. So, but I think at this point, although there is another NSA on the Pakistani side, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, it's quite clearly, I think Delhi has learned and is dealing with Faiz Hamid, who is the ISI chief. That's what the back channel was, I think, in the last few months. Mr. Doval meeting General Faiz Hamid to deal with the issue. So I think it makes sense to keep the army as the main, because they are the main power. Although Imran Khan is creating problems, it's good to deal directly with the army. And if the army then gets the civilian leaders, there's better chance of that than civilians convincing Pakistan army to do things with India.
So then the last question, or second last maybe, there's been a lot of talk. So I think one sort of whispers, I don't know if we should go on speculation, but from what we can see is that neither India or Pakistan, do you think, for India, especially the China factor, for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the scope of that sort of fluid border on the Durand line, influx of refugees, whatever you want to call it, influx of refugees, migrants, whatever, that kind of uncertainty of policing that border and this. do you think that also the moment is ripe also because neither country at this point, ravaged by COVID, economy is not doing well in both cases, can afford the kind of high tension troops, money, national attention to be on one small portion of their border, whereas both I think have bigger now border struggles on the other side. I mean, we've been claiming this two-front war thing that Pakistan can't buy, but in a reasonable perspective, both countries seem to be in a position where it's, and peace or whatever, some form of more peace is pragmatic. How do you see that?
So I would say, look, there is always, I mean, I think, for example, throughout the last 30 years, when this peace process has gone up and down, the Indian Prime Minister would say, look, poverty is the real challenge. So let's work together to deal with poverty.
Yeah.
But the circumstances didn't really work out. Immediately after 91, Pakistan was on a high. They just won in Afghanistan by driving out the Soviet troops, and they were in this mood of, look, they can use the jihad as an instrument of foreign policy. But today, I think Pakistan's circumstances have certainly changed to the extent that, as you said, look, they're in the grip of the Financial Action Task Force, which has complicated them. The problem of using jihadi groups has run into problems with the FATF, with the US. Now, its domestic Islamism has run into problems with Europe, which is saying, look, no GSP if you use blasphemy laws the way you're doing. So I think there are pressures, and then Afghanistan, of course, is the Western Front opening up in a big way. So I think, what Bajwa said on the face of it, I mean, I think it's impeccable logic that what he said was really good for Pakistan from his perspective. You and I saying it is not what matters, but the Pakistan Army chief said it. But as you saw, Imran Khan is not fully on board. I mean, whether it is really little play inside or whether it is a serious thing, we don't know. On the Indian side too, I mean, we have a two-front situation. Because of COVID, our economy is down. So I think it makes sense to at least pause. I mean, let's not say, look, there's no, a dramatic moment here. We hug each other and say, look, we're all brothers now, or cousins. We were always cousins, but now we're really becoming brothers. But the problem is even a pause, a deliberate pause in the conflict, as opposed to really peace breaking up, it serves both their interests. So that is, you could calm things down, do minimal things if you want to, so that you can focus on your bigger problems. So pause, I mean, after all, states calculate these things closely. So a pause would be sensible and doable. But the problem is, given the demonization that has taken place in the last 1 decade on both sides, so even small moves run into huge political problems. In India, even if we talk to Pakistan, it was going to be made into some kind of a crime, as if talking to Pakistan, I mean, your neighbor, even if he's the worst enemy, the first rule of international politics is you talk to your enemies, assuming that they're your enemy. So that in Pakistan, even engaging India, even buying sugar and cotton, which is turned into some kind of what did Imran Khan say? Kashmiriyon ki, we're going to do sauda nahi karenge. So which is ridiculous, but then that's politics. So I think there is political constraint. The logic of state interest demands at least a pause, if not a peace. So there is enough room, I think, to explore. But then, as I said, the problem for Pakistan is a bigger problem today, because for them, the whole strategy on Kashmir, of their willingness, they claim to change the equations in Indian Kashmir. Now, India, by doing what it did in August 2019, has put them in a fix. Now, do you demand a complete reversal of what happened in 2019 to start the peace process? Or do you say some confidence building measures are okay, a roadmap is good enough? Or you say Kashmiri's welfare today is more important than the fundamental questions of Kashmir's relationship with India? I think for them, if they accept the status quo and say, let's do CBMs, they get into one kind of trouble. But on the other hand, if they say, no, we're going to continue this battle for another 75 years after partition. So that again, I mean, I think the circumstances show that's not been possible. Pakistan's hand vis-a-vis India has weakened somewhat. I mean, I think to be fair, India's GDP is now almost 10 times larger than Pakistan's. India's closer relationship with the West, except that China, Pakistan's relationship, the rest of the world is in a difficult kind of situation. So I think Pakistan is the one which has to swallow that bitter pill. Does it bite the bullet and say, let's do some things, or take the safe option, do nothing, keep talking, and hope like hell something will happen?
Great, sir. Thanks so much. Everyone, check out the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com and probably wherever you're watching this video. Thanks so much. Thank you so much.